The hard problem of consciousness is the question of, well, how on God's earth does the water of the brain turn into the wine of subjective conscious experience? So from the inside, we wake up and we're flooded with the tastes of red and or the taste of red if you're synesthetic. But the colors red, the music, all of that aliveness. From an outside in view, you get behavior. You cut open to a new person, you get brain. Nowhere in there do you get subjective experience. People struggle with what they call the explanatory gap. Like, how the hell does the brain, why even does the neuroinformation processing, which we can kind of get a grip on, why exactly does that turn into experience, and how should we think about that? I believe there are really two clearly differentiating problems here, or that need to be differentiated. So one is the problem of sort of the neuroscience. We can sort of reduce, clearly at least if we're talking about brain-based consciousness, there's a lot of brain-based mystery or interest, and you need a lot of neuroscience knowledge to think about the underlying, what I call the neurobiological engineering problem. And that's sort of a bottom-up aspect of the explanatory gap. But there's also a real top-down aspect of the explanatory gap. And this is exemplified, I think, if you get into like the philosophy of mind literature. I was reading Philip Goff's Galileo's Error, and he opens with the claim, hey, Galileo creates the hard problem of consciousness. And you're like, what the fuck is that? How did that happen? Right? You know?
Go there for a second. That's interesting.
And basically what he says is, well, what Galileo did is he founded natural science. And natural science splits the world into quantifiable, objectively observable entities that you then mathematically map. And that gives rise to physics and the natural science grounding. But what it does also is it factors out the subjective qualities of the world. And so it really splits the world ontologically really into primary and secondary qualities, the qualities of mind-independent real physical stuff versus mind-dependent impressions. And then it also epistemologically splits it into a third-person objective observer versus a first-person experience. So actually inside of physics is a dualism, is a fundamental dualism that then grounds the way in which physicists justify studying physical behavior. And you find that you can do that reasonably well in the broad physical categories like stars and galaxies. Chemicals work pretty well that way. Even cells arguably work that way. However, when you get into another subjective experiencing being from the inside that you can't directly observe, there are all sorts of epistemological problems. Like, how do you know it's there? This is like the zombie problem. That's a philosophical zombie problem. Is like, how do you know, even if it behaves this way, that it actually has an inner experience? How would you tell that? And the ontological problem is, well, yeah, what are the mechanisms? And I believe actually the ontological problem is much more than just what are the mechanisms. It's actually what's the philosophical landscape? What's the metaphysical landscape? And this is where UTOK really comes in and gives us, I think, a much better framing of the hard problem. And indeed, as I talked about in my book, A New Synthesis for Solving the Problem of Psychology, addressing the Enlightenment gap, I argued that the problem of psychology arose because of the Enlightenment gap. And I actually think that's really a big part of the hard problem as well. And that is, what are the concepts and categories that we're using? How do we understand knowledge from different perspectives? Science is not the only way of knowing. We need to broaden our epistemological structure, see how they complement to get a whole picture. We also need a much clearer understanding of the ontological stack. So I'm basically arguing that you can split the hard problem into the neurobiological engineering problem, the Enlightenment gap as the top-end philosophical problem, and I think we can do much better at solving the Enlightenment gap aspect and delineating the philosophical and ontological, epistemological elements. The Enlightenment gap, as I described it, is as science took hold and created a particular way in which people justify, that are attached to meaning, be like, oh, that's interesting that we're attached to this meaning. But if we then step inside and even adopt your frame, say, well, it's practically useful in this context. Once you do step inside of it, what you get is a relatively conciliant picture of physics into chemistry into biology. But then that really breaks down. And the Enlightenment gap basically says we do not have a coherent, holistic picture that places matter in relationship to mind, that's the ontological aspect of it, and scientific knowing in right relationship to subjective and social knowing. So the Enlightenment gap is the failure to generate a clear ontological and epistemological picture, justification system that places the pieces in right relation so that we can have basically a coherent outline of the puzzle. That's what we are completely lacking, an analytical outline. That's why you have people say, oh, the mind-body problem, or, consciousness is the greatest problem in science. Does it fit in science? All of that stuff. Is there consilience? And most people say no, but we can grope towards it. Those kinds of things. So the Enlightenment gap points to the failure of a philosophical structure to make sense out of the world in that way.
Yeah. If you could get in touch with that almost shift from sleeping to waking, anytime you open your eyes, like what's here is a nowness and a realness of experiencing something. I call it isness. We might call it awakeness. We might call it consciousness, not giving it any agency or position, but it's like the thing that I'm conscious of. But notice I've added an I there, right? Like I've already jumped to add, like I'm conscious of it. It's before that even, there's just an awakeness and an aliveness and isness that's there, right? What Mike Levin is saying about consciousness, right? Could consciousness be, and I don't hate something like this as a definition of agentic consciousness, because we are getting into Markov blankets and sensing and acting and representing inside. What is that whole thing, right? So could consciousness be just what it feels like to be in charge of this constant self-construction, driven to reinterpret all available data? Like, what's my context? What are my memories? How do I mash that up into what the agent should do? If I can sit in more isness, I don't have to be conscious in that way, which is why this would be an entirely different level. I would say level 4 is agent consciousness doing. If all of a sudden I put down that the agent doesn't need to do anything, the agent can primarily value watching, doing still occurs, because I can still mindfully do, etc. But there's a totally different connection to the kind of doing that needs to happen and the valuing of what happens. And what you find there are selves that are not pretending or being overly egoic and selfish and difficult. They can really put down selfish narratives to be genuinely loving, genuinely helpful, genuinely full of peace and happiness, etc. Now they're overflowing, and all of a sudden they can be cause to that going out. Right now we can start to sincerely help, sincerely have care for strangers, sincerely do all these things. And I don't want to go a bridge too far where somebody's like, well, that loving strangers, what are you talking about? But sincerely, like that's what comes online, because my needs are already met, right? So almost in a Maslow hierarchy kind of thing, you get into this self-transcendence in a very meaningful way by quite literally transcending self, right? Like putting this self-structure down to be in relation with what is, which if the word God is incredibly triggering for many people in all these ways. But if God is everything, let's say, maybe that's just universe, maybe it's just isness, whatever word we give it, I'm a part of it in some way. If I can all of a sudden love the expression of this isness as it is, sincerely, not because I'm faking it, not because somebody told me to, not because I'm believing in it, but because it's truly awe-striking just that anything is going on at all, right? What comes online is I'm already full, and now things like eating and meeting my basic human needs become deeply fun, like making a delicious salad or whatever, right? It's just like those become wonderful, but I also can be really resilient in that if I'm hungry for a long period of time, like that will be okay too, right? Because I'm not overly attached to it having to be any certain way. I'm connected to the watching of however it kind of arises. And that leads to smoothing and beauty and actually dealing with conflict really naturally and in flow states and really beautifully. And that's just a longer thing that I'd be happy to debate with anybody or talk about with anybody.
That's very alive, the whole hard problem thing. There are a couple of different ways to frame it, and I'm framing it, listen, there are a lot of interesting things that are happening in the brain, still some very powerful mysteries, although I do think we're making progress on that. But there are also major philosophical issues, like how we talk about it, what's our language, what are we pointing to, what's our overall ontology,
category
what's our
problems,
epistemology, all that shit. And that's where UTOK actually is particularly powerful and basically, this is what you guys are talking about. But here's the point I want to make relative to what you just said. So I really want folks to really understand our justificatory history, okay? So we get Christianity, okay? Christianity is a dominant structure, and there's a whole narrative that God loves you and his son, and everybody believes it. And that's where they're investing their identity. So the reason the world is meaningful is because all this stuff is true. And it's literally true, and it's justificatorily true. That's what the culture believes, attached to, assuredness of meaning. And then we have natural philosophy. It's like, well, we're going to study God's laws, right? Yeah. But that's just for inanimate matter. And then they unleash science, right? And science unleashes, and then you get, wow, these laws really seem to like lock us down in some material mechanical determinism. And then, oh God, they have Darwin, pun intended. Oh God, we have Darwin, and now all of a sudden we're just these evolved, random, lacking necessity. And guess what happens? Meaning. What was meaningful now is just rocks and random cells, right? And so now we're wandering around. John's, awakening from the meaning crisis, and we're just sort of like, we've misframed this entire thing.
Totally.
We have misframed the entire thing. And what you just said, and then I can then say, well, actually, yeah, I think the analytical understanding of consciousness as it evolves is saying exactly this. And then if we live that way, there's meaning everywhere. It's a beautiful.
Everything is meaningful. Everything is sacred.
And sacred and connected. And it's just a complete transformation across the ego into isness, back down, and the stack. Man, that just feels like a second enlightenment,